The 1950s, a decade often romanticized in the American memory. Picture it, gleaming chrome diners, poodle skirts twirling to jukeboxes, and families gathered around their new television sets. The post-war boom brought prosperity to many, and the American dream seemed within reach. The country, having survived a devastating war, embraced a newfound optimism, a sense of unity and progress. It was a time of innovation, of rock and roll, of suburban expansion, a seemingly idyllic age for many white Americans. But this image of the 1950s, the one often portrayed in popular culture, was only part of the story. It was a veneer, a carefully constructed facade that concealed a darker, more unsettling truth. For beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity and harmony, a deep and pervasive injustice festered. It was an age of stark contradictions, where the promise of equality and the reality of segregation existed in a tense and volatile balance. The American dream, so tantalizingly close for some, remained tragically out of reach for millions of others, their lives circumscribed by the color of their skin. While white America reveled in post-war affluence, African Americans found themselves relegated to the margins. They lived in separate neighborhoods, attended separate schools, and were confined to separate sections of buses, restaurants, and even water fountains. Jim Crow laws, the insidious legal framework of segregation, cast a long and oppressive shadow over the lives of African Americans. These laws, enacted throughout the South after Reconstruction, were designed to disenfranchise black citizens and maintain white supremacy. They were a blatant violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed equal protection under the law and the right to vote respectively. These laws mandated separate facilities for blacks and whites in every aspect of public life. Schools, parks, libraries, restrooms, transportation, even cemeteries, all were segregated. Signs reading white and colored were ubiquitous, a constant reminder of the racial hierarchy that defined the South. But the impact of Jim Crow extended far beyond separate water fountains and bus seats. These laws were designed to systematically disenfranchise African Americans, stripping them of their political power and economic opportunities. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were used to prevent black citizens from voting, while vagrancy laws and other discriminatory practices allowed for the arrest and imprisonment of African Americans on flimsy pretexts. Sarah Louise gripped her grandmother's hand, the worn, calloused skin a source of comfort in the bustling city. Detroit, a beacon of hope and opportunity, felt a world away from the suffocating cotton fields of Mississippi. The air, thick with the scent of industry and exhaust fumes, still smelled sweeter than the humid air of the Delta, where the threat of violence hung heavy and ever-present. Sarah Louise, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, clung to her grandmother's side, navigating the crowded streets, the cacophony of city life a stark contrast to the rhythmic drone of cicadas she knew so well. "Hold your head high, child," her grandmother whispered, her voice a low rumble that carried the weight of generations past. "Remember who you are and whose you are. Don't let nobody tell you different." Her words, a mantra repeated throughout Sarah Louise's young life, resonated with newfound urgency in this unfamiliar landscape. The year was 1955. A chill wind swept through the streets of Chicago, carrying with it a sense of unease and a growing anger that rumbled beneath the surface of daily life. The news of Emmett Till's brutal murder in Money, Mississippi, had sent shockwaves through the black community, the horrific details relayed in hushed tones, a grim reminder of the ever-present danger that lurked beneath the veneer of civility. Emmett, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, had been visiting relatives in the South when he was accused of whistling at a white woman. His alleged crime? A transgression against the unwritten code of racial etiquette that governed the Jim Crow South. Sarah Louise, now 10 years old, overheard snippets of conversation, her parents' hushed voices laced with fear and sorrow. She didn't fully grasp the details, but she understood the fear in their eyes, the way they held her a little tighter, their smiles a little less bright. Emmett's murder, a stark and brutal reminder of the vulnerability of Black bodies in a society that deemed them disposable, hung over their lives like a shroud. School, once a place of joy and discovery for Sarah Louise, became a stark reminder of the inequalities that permeated her world. Her school, situated in the heart of Black Bottom, was a testament to neglect. The building, a dilapidated structure with peeling paint and drafty windows, stood in stark contrast to the gleaming brick facade of the nearby white school. Resources were scarce, textbooks outdated, and the teachers, though dedicated, were overworked and underpaid. Sarah Louise, a bright and inquisitive child, yearned for more. She devoured every book she could find, escaping into worlds both real and imagined. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, of sharing her love of learning with other children, of making a difference. The bus rumbled down Woodward Avenue, its interior a microcosm of the segregated city it traversed. Sarah Louise, clutching a brown paper bag filled with groceries, sat rigidly in the back, her body swaying in rhythm with the vehicle's jerky movements. The air hung heavy with the smell of sweat, exhaust fumes, and unspoken tension. The unspoken rule enforced by custom and fear dictated that Black passengers sat in the back while white passengers occupied the front. To challenge this order was to risk verbal abuse, physical violence, or worse. She had witnessed firsthand the consequences of defiance. Just a few months earlier, a young Black woman, her face etched with quiet dignity, had refused to give up her seat to a white man. The incident, a seemingly small act of resistance, had sparked a citywide bus boycott that lasted for months. The soaring voice of Mahalia Jackson filled the cramped living room, her gospel music a source of solace and inspiration. Sarah Louise, her head resting on her grandmother's lap, closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, the powerful lyrics resonating deep within her soul. Music, a constant presence in the Black community, served as a source of comfort, resistance, and hope. From the soulful blues that gave voice to their sorrows to the uplifting gospel that fueled their spirits, music provided a soundtrack to their lives. On Sunday mornings, the small Baptist church they attended pulsed with energy, the air thick with the scent of incense and the fervor of the congregation. Sarah Louise, her voice blending in with the choir, found solace in the spirituals and hymns that spoke of freedom, both earthly and divine. The church, a cornerstone of the Black community, provided more than just spiritual guidance. It served as a meeting place, a community center, and a safe haven from the harsh realities of life under Jim Crow. But the music that resonated most deeply with Sarah Louise was the music of change, the anthems of the civil rights movement that were sweeping the nation. Jim Crow laws, like insidious vines, had wrapped themselves around every aspect of American society, dictating where African Americans could live, work, and even breathe. The walls of segregation, built with bricks of prejudice and mortar of discrimination, loomed large, casting long shadows over the lives of millions. These walls were not just physical, though the whites-only signs that adorned restrooms, water fountains, and waiting rooms served as stark reminders of the racial hierarchy that permeated society. Housing segregation, enforced through redlining and restrictive covenants, confined African Americans to overcrowded and underserved neighborhoods. These neighborhoods, starved of resources and opportunities, became breeding grounds for poverty and despair, a vicious cycle that spanned generations. The walls of segregation, both physical and metaphorical, served to maintain the racial caste system that underpinned American society. The very fabric of social life was torn and restitched along racial lines. Education, the cornerstone of a just and equitable society, was a battleground in the fight against Jim Crow. The separate but equal doctrine, enshrined in the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision of 1896, had legalized segregation in public schools, creating a system that was anything but equal. Black schools, chronically underfunded and under-resourced, stood in stark contrast to their white counterparts, a testament to the enduring legacy of racial inequality. Imagine classrooms overflowing with students, textbooks tattered and outdated, and teachers, though dedicated, stretched thin by the weight of systemic neglect. Imagine children, their minds eager for knowledge, denied the basic tools they needed to succeed. This was the reality for millions of African American children across the country. The disparity in educational opportunities was not merely a matter of resources. It was a deliberate attempt to stifle the potential of an entire generation. By denying Black children a quality education, the architects of segregation sought to maintain the racial hierarchy that underpinned their power. The walls of segregation extended beyond the realm of social interaction, constricting the economic opportunities available to African Americans and relegating them to the margins of a booming post-war economy. Jim Crow laws, coupled with discriminatory practices by businesses and labor unions, created a system that systematically disadvantaged Black workers, trapping them in a cycle of poverty and despair. Imagine a job application, your qualifications exceeding those of your white counterparts, only to be met with a polite rejection, the unspoken reason hanging heavy in the air. Imagine toiling long hours in menial jobs, your labor fueling the engine of the American economy, yet denied the wages and opportunities afforded to your white counterparts. The economic disparities of the Jim Crow era were staggering. African Americans faced higher unemployment rates, lower wages, and limited access to capital, effectively shutting them out of the American dream of homeownership and upward mobility. The economic disparities of the Jim Crow era were staggering. The insidious reach of Jim Crow extended even to the realm of healthcare, where African Americans faced discrimination, neglect, and outright hostility, their health and well-being sacrificed at the altar of white supremacy. Hospitals, often segregated by law or custom, provided inferior care to Black patients, if they were treated at all. Imagine a mother, her child burning with fever, turned away from a hospital because of the color of her skin. Imagine a man, his body racked with pain, denied access to the same medical advancements that were readily available to his white counterparts. This was the reality for countless African Americans during the Jim Crow era. Black doctors and nurses, often relegated to segregated hospitals and clinics, faced discrimination and disrespect from their white colleagues, their skills and expertise undermined by the pervasive racism of the time. The Tuskegee syphilis study, a horrific example of medical racism, stood as a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of Black bodies in the face of systemic prejudice. The Tuskegee syphilis study, a horrific example of medical racism, stood as a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of Black bodies in the face of systemic prejudice. Section 5. Seeds of resistance planted. Despite Jim Crow, seeds of resistance were sown in the African American community. The NAACP, SCLC, and CORE mobilized communities and organized protests. Rosa Parks's defiance in the Montgomery bus boycott showed the power of nonviolent action. Ordinary people, united in dissent, inspired protests across the South. Resistance grew in the hearts and minds of a new generation. Black churches became incubators for social change and community organizing. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. emerged, spreading hope and determination. The air crackled with anticipation as a young preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., addressed the crowd at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He spoke of the indignities suffered by his people, the daily humiliations of segregation, and the systematic denial of their basic human rights. His words ignited a fire in the hearts of those gathered, reflecting fear, hope, and defiance. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks, thrust King into the national spotlight. At 26, King led a movement challenging American society's foundations. The boycott, a testament to nonviolent resistance, captured the nation's attention. Inspired by Gandhi, King urged meeting hate with love and violence with peace. The boycott ended with a Supreme Court ruling declaring bus segregation unconstitutional, marking a civil rights victory. The spirit of resistance ignited in Montgomery spread like wildfire across the South, challenging segregation in every aspect of public life. In Greensboro, 4 Black college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter and refused to leave. Their act of defiance sparked a wave of sit-ins across the South. The sit-ins, often met with violence, tested the limits of nonviolent resistance. The Freedom Rides, organized by CORE, challenged segregation on interstate buses. The Freedom Riders faced fierce resistance, their buses firebombed, their bodies beaten. President Kennedy dispatched federal marshals to protect the riders, marking a shift in public opinion. The fight for civil rights was not just about desegregating lunch counters or buses, it was about the fundamental right to vote, denied through poll taxes and literacy tests. SNCC launched voter registration drives across the South, facing fierce resistance from white supremacists. In Mississippi, SNCC workers risked their lives to register Black voters. They faced arrest, beatings, and even death. The March on Washington in 1963 drew over 250,000 people, uniting civil rights organizations, labor unions, and religious groups. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech became iconic, resonating far beyond the National Mall. Section 4. A movement takes shape. The civil rights movement was a diverse tapestry of individuals and organizations, each with its own strategies and goals. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC advocated for nonviolent resistance, while SNCC and CORE became disillusioned with the slow pace of change. Malcolm X emerged as a powerful voice for Black nationalism and self-determination. The Black Panther Party advocated for armed self-defense and social programs. The diversity of voices and tactics reflected the complexity of the struggle for racial equality. Section 5. Legacies of Struggle, Seeds of Change. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s led to landmark legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws outlawed discrimination and dismantled Jim Crow, paving the way for greater equality. The movement inspired other social justice movements, including women's rights and LGBTQ+ rights. Tactics like nonviolent resistance and grassroots organizing became blueprints for global social change. The civil rights movement reminds us of the power of ordinary people to challenge injustice. The 1950s, a decade often viewed through a nostalgic lens, stands as a stark reminder of the complexities and contradictions that have shaped the American narrative. It was a decade of both remarkable progress and deeply entrenched inequality, of soaring rhetoric about freedom and justice juxtaposed against the brutal realities of segregation and discrimination. The fight for civil rights reached a boiling point in the 1950s, fanned by the courage and determination of ordinary men and women. History is not a static diorama, but an ongoing tapestry, woven by the actions and inactions of generations past. The 1950s, with its triumphs and tragedies, reminds us of the unfinished business of equality. The echoes of that era urge us to confront the enduring legacies of racism and discrimination. The personal stories of those who lived through the Jim Crow South serve as a testament to the enduring power of hope. Progress is not a linear trajectory, but a winding journey marked by setbacks and victories. While the overt systems of segregation that defined the Jim Crow South may have been dismantled, the echoes of that era continue to resonate in the present, reminding us that the struggle for racial equality is far from over. Systemic racism continues to permeate American society, manifesting in disparities in education, healthcare, housing, and criminal justice. The fight for civil rights was about creating a society where all people have equal opportunities to thrive. The long shadow of injustice casts a pall over the American narrative, a stark reminder of the ways in which our nation has often failed to live up to its ideals. The struggle for civil rights, both past and present, lays bare the uncomfortable truth that freedom and equality have not always been extended to all citizens equally. The systemic racism that permeated the Jim Crow era did not simply vanish with the stroke of a pen or the passage of legislation. It morphed, adapted, and burrowed deeper into the fabric of American society, manifesting in new and insidious ways. From the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately ensnares Black and brown youth to the racial wealth gap that perpetuates economic inequality, the legacy of Jim Crow continues to cast a long shadow over the present. The fight for civil rights is not a distant historical event. It is an ongoing struggle that demands our continued attention and action. To confront the enduring legacy of Jim Crow, we must move beyond superficial gestures of reconciliation and engage in a deep and unflinching examination of the ways in which racism continues to permeate our institutions and our individual lives. The struggle for equality is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation from all of us. We must educate ourselves about the history of racism and discrimination and confront our own biases. Listen to the voices of those who have experienced racism and amplify their stories. Acknowledge our shared history and work together for a just and equitable future. The struggle for equality is a collective endeavor that benefits us all. Build a nation where all people are treated with dignity and respect,